Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel, Fish Den 365. I'm Den Haring. Good to be here with you. If you remember the last time we talked, I said my next video was going to be one you don't want to miss, and that's what the video is today. It's about a presentation that I developed some years ago. I've only ever showed it to a few people that were fishing tournaments with me. I've never showed it to anybody else. I've never shared it here. It's a jig. It's a jig presentation that I've developed. It works so well, I call it the Magic Jig. And I've caught more big bass on this jig than any other lure I've ever thrown. Maybe every other lure I've ever thrown combined. That's how many big bass I've caught on this jig presentation, and we're going to show it to you now. That's what I'm talking about. What you need for this Magic Jig is one of your favorite jigs. I don't think it matters a whole lot what it is. I like to use the stone jig for this because I can fish it vertically, but I could also swim it along. And this jig presentation that I'm going to show you, it works both ways, so that becomes important. So I have a number of different color stone jigs here because I'm going to show you how I handle a bluegill pattern versus a shad pattern, that kind of thing. So let's take a look at this this first one here. Okay, I've got this jig. The next part of this presentation is using a Biffle bug. Now I've done a video about Biffle bugs and how they are one of the most versatile baits you can use. I'll link that video up here while I get this ready. So you want to pull the Biffle bug out. In this particular case, I've got one here. This is green pumpkin chartreuse pepper. This will be a good color to go with this jig presentation. So the first thing you want to do, and this is a 4.25 inch Biffle bug. Almost every time I use that size, but if you wanted to have a bigger profile, you can do the 5.5 inch, or you can go down to the 3.5 inch if you want to use a smaller profile, maybe for smallmouths. I'm going to cut these side legs off here, these side legs right here. So we cut this one off. Just go right against the body with it. There's no need to have it. You could keep one on and it'll make some more action. I think I'll show you that a little later. But I like to trim them off. Now, the next thing is, this is where the secret comes with this bait. And it's amazing how this thing works and how it ends up looking in the water. But you want to, and you can take a little bit off the top here. You can cut a little bit off. I'll just cut it maybe just 2 ridges off of here. And you don't have to, but you can make the jig look a little smaller this way. If you want to keep it on there, you can make the jig look bigger that way. But we're going to rig this thing on here vertically so that it sits like this. Now this bait has a seam. So when you rig this on here, you want to make sure that you're putting this hook right down that seam, because it's important that this goes on vertically, not flat like this, but vertical like this, and you'll see why in a minute. So we're going to rig this thing up now. I go right down the center here, and go around and right out the top, and then we're just going to push this thing right up to the top of the jig, and that's what it looks like right there. That's perfect. And now you can see I've got this vertical bait, this presentation that looks like this. Can you start to see how this profile might be beneficial? Take a look at that. That's the profile of the jig. So you have this thing falling like this with this tail. And here's the secret to the Magic Jig. Couple secrets to fishing it. When you reel this bait in, what you're going to notice is that this tail has a very interesting movement. You know how the Kitex, they have the Kitex Swing Impact's got that real large, wide wiggle waggle. This does not have that at all. It's just the opposite. It's just a real subtle tail flutter. This tail just flutters. It just wiggles like this. It just wiggles very, very slow, very, very enticingly. But if you ever watched a bluegill in the water, or any bait fish for that matter, when it propels itself forward, that's how it moves its tail. It doesn't have that large wiggle waggle situation that you see on the Kitex. And they work great, so don't get me wrong. It's just that this is something that they haven't seen so much before, this jig rigged this way. So when this thing falls to the bottom, this tail is working all the way down, hits the bottom, and then the jig will usually just fall flat. The other thing is when I like to usually pop this thing up and just let it fall back down a few times before I reel it in. Oftentimes, though, the hit comes on the very first fall on the way down. But the other thing that happens with this is that if they don't hit then, you can just reel this thing back at a moderate pace, maybe stop and go now and then. And this tail's working all the way, and this thing's working all the way back to the boat, and it just looks like a bluegill, in this particular case, swimming back to the boat. And I've caught fish doing that as well. So this thing can work two ways for you. That's why I call it the Magic Jig, and you got to try it, because if you do, you're going to be amazed. If you give this thing an honest try, in other words, if you fish this thing for a number of good hours and throw it in the right places, I promise you, you'll be throwing it again, because the dang thing works. And it works everywhere. It works in weeds. It's great in milfoil. One of the best things I've ever thrown in brush piles. This thing kills fish in brush piles where there's bluegill or even shad. It works in lily pad fields, everywhere you can think of, any cover situation you can think of. This is always tied on in my boat as long as I'm fishing a lake or a body of water that has some good sized fish in it and has some stain to the water. If the water was extremely clear, I'd downsize this jig. But in most cases, I've always got one of these things tied on, and it works every time of the year. It works right now in early spring. I like to fish a shad pattern. So the way I do that is I'll use a shad pattern colored jig, and I use the gizzard shad colored Biffle bug. So here's a 4.25 inch gizzard shad Biffle bug. I cut these tails off, or these arms off, these legs I should say. The tail you got to keep on there. The tail is critical. Cut them off. I got my shad shape on here, and I would just like I did with that other bait, it would go on just like this. And now I've got a shad profile because I've got this whitish bait, this whitish grayish bait. Excellent shad profile. Turn this around so you can see the color this way. It's just a great bait to throw in the spring when the shad are coming shallow. And then later in spring, throughout the summer and fall, I'm usually throwing some kind of bluegill pattern, maybe something like this, or a perch pattern. Here's another color. Then you just pick the appropriate gizzard bug, Biffle bug, to go along with it, and it's just one hell of a great presentation. So that's it. That's the Magic Jig, and one of the other ways that you definitely want to fish this thing, because I've caught some of my biggest ones this way. It requires a lot of patience, but it does work. You throw it out there at your target, wherever that target is. Could be a brush pile, could be a lily pad field, whatever. You throw it out there and you just let it go to the bottom, right? And it goes to the bottom, it hits the bottom, it looks like a bluegill, maybe injured, and it just kind of falls over on the bottom and it fluffs out. And this tail in the water is just kind of always, moving because it's just so light. And you can see that there's hardly any plastic to that tail. So it's lifelike, right? It looks like a dying bluegill on the bottom. And then if you just, the slightest lift of your rod where that comes up and it comes back down, you're basically keeping it on the bottom. Comes up and down, and then that tail just moves again. And just let it sit. Let it sit for as long as you can stand it sometimes. And when you go to reel in or when you go to pick up on your rod, oftentimes you'll feel weight. When you feel that weight, you set the hook hard as you can, because that's usually going to be your big bass. They just clamp onto it and they hold onto it down there. So that's another secret to using the Magic Jig, is to dead stick it on the bottom. It works very well that way. So I don't know if anybody else fishes this thing this way. It kind of reminds you of the old jig and eel, except the jig and eel methodology would always be fishing the eel part flat like this. And that, I imagine that would work well too, right? It has a nice profile to it, but I like to make it look like that bait fish profile. I want it to look like a bluegill or a shad, the way it would really swim in the water. And I'm telling you, this thing does it in spades. So when you're, if you want to try a new bait this year, try a new combination, assuming you have some Biffle bugs, put this on your favorite jig. Try it and tell me. You got to text me and let me know. Comment and let me know how you did on it, because it's probably the best big fish bait I've ever thrown. And now the secret's out. So throw it out there a little bit. Let me know what you think of it. Let me know what you think of the idea. I'm looking at this and I can see some other applications for this, and I've done this too, by the way. This same Biffle bug works very well on a chatterbait, on the back of a vibrating jig. It just looks great on the back of those jigs too. So you can throw it on a vibrating jig, chatterbait, catches fish that way too. Just some more ways to use one of my favorite and most versatile baits, the Biffle bug, along with the jig in this case. Well, folks, we're living in some really challenging times right now. The world is going crazy. We have a serious virus going around with COVID-19. We have economic strains like you wouldn't believe. And I'm not sure the world is ever going to look quite the same as it did 6 months ago. I think the world we're going to be living in the future may be quite different. That being said, I hope we can all still fish, and I hope we can all still enjoy the freedoms that we enjoy today. Remember, take care of one another. This is the time where you want to be safe, you want to take care of your family, you want to take care of those that you love and your friends and your neighbors. And as always, when you're out on the water, may God bless your fishing endeavors, and may God bless any other endeavor that you need to find yourself in. Hope everything works out for the best, and I hope to see you on the water.